Hi, Amy, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi,
Good
well,
evening, everybody. Hi.
good morning. Is it right in the
It
UK?
is 10
Yeah,
a.m.
10 a.m. Yeah. Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'll be helping out with the translation interpretation later on for the FAQ session. So, just wanted to give you a warm welcome to 2026 Eating Disorder Awareness Week. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
안녕. 5분에 할게요. 지금 한 분씩 계속 들어오고 계셔가지고.
I think we'll probably start 5 past. We still have a couple of people like trying to dial in. So is that okay? Yeah. So we'll give about like 3 more minutes.
소원님이 있어서 너무 다행입니다. 한 가지 걱정은 이 노트북이 영상 재생하다가 멈추진 않을까 걱정이긴 한데 이미 저희 영상이 있으니까 어떻게든 대처 방법은 있을 거라고 생각은 하고요.
네.
뭐 시작을 해도 될 것 같습니다. 네, 시작을 해볼게요.
네, 알겠습니다.
네. 여러분, 태령님 하트 보내주셔서 감사합니다. 이 하트는 어떻게 보내는 건가요? 아이고, 하트 감사합니다. 네, 지금 무슨 스트리머가 된 것 같은 기분인데요. 네, 와주셔서 너무 감사합니다. 그리고 특히 에이민 교수님께 너무 감사드리죠. 이렇게 너무 훌륭하신 몇십 년 동안 연구하신 내용들을 저희와 이렇게 기꺼이 공유해 주셔서 너무 감사한 마음으로 이 자리에 초대를 했고요. 그러면 에이미 님이 미리 준비해 주신 영상에 저희 이화여대 학생분들이 서브타이틀을 달아주셨는데 그 영상을 이제 공유를 하겠습니다. 같이 보겠습니다.
So Amy, we'll start with showing your video that you pre-recorded, and yeah, we'll start now.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Amy Chandler, and I am delighted to be opening this Eating Disorders Awareness Week series of events organised by Rabbits in Submarine and Jeannie Park. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is an honour and a little bit intimidating to be starting off this week of what is going to be a series of really wonderful talks, interventions and reflections from others. So I will do my best. As I said, my name is Amy Chandler. I'm a professor and sociologist based in the School of Health and Social Science at the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. And the talk that I'm giving today is not about eating disorders. So it's perhaps a slightly odd way of starting, but Jeannie has asked me to talk through this topic because I very much agree here. There are, I think, a lot of potential relationships and connections between self-harm, self-injury, and a broad range of practices that we might call eating disorders. So the title that I'm going to be speaking today, the talk, is Wearing Your Heart Under Your Sleeve, Self-Injury, Bodies and Emotions. And in this talk, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the work that I've been doing over the last almost 20 years now, looking at sociological understandings and understandings of self-injury and self-harm. kind of content warning before I go into the talk proper. The talk is about self-harm and self-injury, and I will be drawing on the accounts of a range of different people who've had experiences with self-injury and self-harm. There is going to be some talk about some of the methods involved in that. These are very brief, but perhaps partly, as indicated in the title, my approach and orientation to thinking about and with self-harm and self-injury does take seriously the role of bodies and embodiment and bodily practices in understanding what self-injury and self-harm are. They really make up what it is, as well as how we might respond to it and then understand it. I'll explain further why I am so interested in bodies when we're thinking about self-injury and self-harm. And I think that bodies are another important point of connection between self-injury, self-harm and eating disorders. But this is just a note of content, so take care of yourselves. If you think that this kind of content might be challenging, be difficult to hear, turn it off, walk away. Please feel free to not engage. It's your choice. So I'll go into my actual talk here and the overview of what I'm going to try and cover in the next 40 minutes or so. So I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to self-injury, self-harm. What are we talking about? As well as talking a little bit about what a sociological perspective can bring, and how that might be perhaps different from really the dominant fields of research that tend to focus on studying and making claims about self-injury and self-harm, which tend to be psychology and psychiatry. Sociology is a bit of a small part in this overall picture, although I would obviously argue is an important one. The bulk of my talk is going to be focusing on and working with ideas about emotions and the way in which people who have experiences with self-injury and self-harm account for and talk about emotions when they're trying to make sense of, explain and understand their own practices of self-harm. So the majority of my work has been really about doing interviews with people to understand and try and work with their own explanations, understandings of their practice of self-harm, and to make connections between what people say about self-harm and the social and cultural worlds that they live in. The majority of my work, as well, it's worth highlighting, has been carried out in the United Kingdom, so it's in a particular cultural context. And again, this is something that perhaps in the question and answer session we can explore further, how specific that context might be and what kind of variations and differences might play out in different places across the world where self-harm and self-injury happen. So I'm going to move on from talking about emotional worlds of self-injury to thinking more about bodies and the challenge of visible self-injury. And this kind of plays into an essential theme of a lot of the work that I've done in terms of working with people's accounts of self-injury, as well as how cultural understandings of self-injury play out, which then centres around this notion of authenticity. What is real self-harm, what is legitimate self-harm, and what is not. Now, me saying those things isn't to say that I've got a particular view on them, but what I'm going to show and discuss with you are the ways that this notion of authenticity, the idea that there is a legitimate or real way of practicing self-harm that is more legitimate or real than others, is something that has been a really important feature of the way that people talk about self-harm when they're doing research interviews with me, as well as I'll suggest, in terms of broader cultural understandings of self-harm. Now, the notion of authenticity is also one that I think has some really interesting connections to ideas and discourses about eating disorders. So again, that's something that would be perhaps really interesting to discuss further in the question and answer session. So self-injury and self-harm, what are we talking about? This is an important question because across the kind of history of research on self-harm and indeed public discourse about self-harm and self-injury, this has changed a lot. There's been a lot of disagreements, contestations about what are the proper names that we would call something called self-injury and self-harm. What kind of practices are we talking about? I'm going to try and summarize quite a lot of complexity here just to really just underline the messiness that we're working with here. So at the moment, there are a number of different words that kind of fly around when we're talking about self-injury and self-harm. As you'll note, I'm using self-injury and self-harm kind of interchangeably, and I'll explain why in a second. So one name that you might have heard of, it is one that kind of has been kind of formalized in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the latest version being version 5, published in 2013, and that proposed a new diagnostic category of non-suicidal self-injury. This is a disorder that is in need of further research, and indeed many researchers, especially in the United States, which obviously has quite some influence globally, argue that there is a kind of definitive disorder that should be called non-suicidal self-injury and is made up of a range of different kind of practices that involve harming largely the outside of the body, and it is not suicide. Now, this is subject to some disagreement. Researchers and policymakers, healthcare workers in countries like the United Kingdom, as well as Australia and some others, prefer to use the term self-harm or deliberate self-harm, and they don't separate off self-harm from suicide. There are all sorts of arguments here about whether or not we can ever determine intent when we're talking about self-harm or self-injury, whether or not it is or is not suicidal. People change their minds. People tell different stories at different times. Sometimes people might die and they may not have intended to, and we will never know. So there are important reasons, I think, why it might be important to not make that separation. At the same time, for many people who self-harm, there are very clear and strong understandings from their own explanations that self-harm is not about suicide. And so again, this is not a clear separation. It's not, there are lots of disagreements, contestations and complexity here. Indeed, other terms that are used to talk about self-harm do include attempted suicide. And again, this is one that doesn't sit easily with many people who have experiences of self-harm, because they don't experience those experiences and practices as being anything to do with suicide. Self-harm without the deliberate is very commonly used. Parasuicide is a much older term that still occasionally appears, and again comes from early kind of psychoanalytic thinking, which suggested that self-harm was a way of kind of practicing suicide in a way without resulting in death. Other terms include self-injurious behaviours, self-inflicted violence, and self-injury, which for my own work was a term that I preferred for quite some years. And in part, this was because when I first started to look at self-harm as an academic researcher back in 2003, when I was doing an undergraduate dissertation, I started looking at sort of existing research on self-injury and self-harm and found that most of it was carried out in accident and emergency departments, and that most of the people or patients who are involved in those studies had taken overdoses and were being treated in hospital following an overdose. Now, my own work is informed deeply by my own lived experiences with self-harm, which has included overdoses, but primarily has taken the form of self-cutting. Now, self-cutting or self-injuries to the outside of the body were really absent in a lot of the existing research back in the early 2000s. So in my undergraduate dissertation and then later my doctoral research, I focused on what I termed self-injury, so injuries to the outside of the body. However, once I started doing interviews with other people who had experiences with self-injury, I found that they described a very wide range of other self-harming practices, including overdoses, but also eating too much, too little, self-induced vomiting, drug and alcohol use, risky sports, driving too fast, negative self-thoughts, talking badly about oneself internally, damaging relationships with others, sleep deprivation, to name just a few. This has led me over the years to sort of begin to shift away from using the term self-injury alone to using the broader term self-harm and having really quite an open idea or view of what that might mean to different people. It sort of acknowledges that what self-harm means to different people, the kind of practices involved, the way that bodies are used, whether they're involved at all, is really, really wide-ranging, and that there are potentially, and again, this is something perhaps we can pick up, potentially interesting connections, overlaps between a range of different self-harmful practices. So what are we talking about? Many different things. However, what I will say is that what I'm going to be talking about largely in terms of the research data that I'll be drawing on in the next few moments, this draws in particular on the research that I did that did centre self-injury rather than self-harm. So it's largely about injuries to the outside of the body, but not only. I could talk about definitions all day, so we will move on. So the contribution of sociology, and I'm just going to see if I can move my head out of the way a little bit here. We'll just go up here. so that you can see other people's names. So I am one of a number of different sociologists who have contributed to broader scholarship and research on self-harm. So I kind of just want to flag here that although the vast majority of research about self-harm or self-injury is carried out by people who are trained in psychology and in psychiatry, there are a small group of people who have been trained in sociology or social sciences and who have made really important contributions to understanding the connections between self-injury, self-harm, and broader social and cultural and political factors. So I name a few of them here. Do look up their work if you're interested in knowing more. But then their names are here. I will speak them into the room and then we'll move on to the next bits. But Patricia and Peter Adler, so they're based in the United States. Baptiste Brossard has carried out studies of French-speaking people's experiences with self-harm. Mark Creswell, who has looked at the kind of experiences of survivor and service user movements around self-harm, again in the United Kingdom. Catherine Daly, writing about the Australian experience. Kate Inkle, looking at connections between disability studies and self-injury, MAD studies in the United Kingdom. Liz McDermott and Katrina Rowan, again, looking at experiences with self-harm among young people and particularly among young LGBTQ plus people in the UK primarily. And then finally, Pete Steggles, who's done a number of different studies looking at people's accounts and experiences of self-harm, both on his own and with other colleagues from the Universities of York and Newcastle. So few people to look up if you're interested in knowing more about what other sociologists do before I talk about my work. So I'll move my head back down now. So a lot of what I'm going to be drawing on in the next slides draws on research that is collected together in the book that I published in 2016 called Self-Injury, Medicine and Society, Authentic Bodies. This book is situated in two different fields of sociology. The sociology of health and illness, which is where a lot of my work is kind of focused, and that takes a critical sociological approach to looking at how medical practice is shaped by society, how medical research is shaped by society, by cultural ideas. It is a critical study. And I'm also drawing on sociologies or sociological approaches to the body. Again, these take the idea of the body as bodies are not solely natural, how we experience our bodies, how we understand our bodies, how our bodies move through the world. All of these things are not natural and given. They are shaped by society and by culture. And there's a rich kind of history of theorizing within sociology, which gives us different tools to think critically with bodies. And that's really very much what I was interested in doing. So I'm drawing particularly here on two of my earlier studies, both of which are kind of featured in the book. So I did, as part of my doctoral research back in 2007 and 2008, I held 24 interviews with 12 adults who were aged between 21 and 37 at the time, and who were talking about their lived experiences with self-injury, so primarily in the form of self-cutting, but also for some self-burning and hitting and so on. I also then did a later postdoctoral study looking specifically at the experiences of younger people with self-harm. Part of the reason that I did that study was because although there's a kind of acknowledged, and it continues to be a very strong kind of feature of broader discourse about self-harm, that is something that is particularly affecting young people, particularly young women. But the majority of research, even though much research identifies that self-harm often starts, not always, but often starts for people when they are in their early to mid-teens, the majority of research that was qualitative in nature, so involved speaking to people with those experiences, spoke to much older young people, as I had done in my own first study. So with this study, I explicitly was trying to look at people aged 13 to 16. Did have a couple of older people who were in their early 20s who took part, but the majority of the 88 young people who took part in a qualitative online survey and some follow-up interviews in 2014 were all aged under the age 16 and under in the main. As I mentioned earlier, my approach to studying self-harm, the reason I find myself in this field of work, is in part informed and shaped by my own lived experience. This is something that has always been present in my scholarship, and in recent years, in part because I have got older, it's become a kind of something that has been more explicitly a part of what I do. So I was really, really privileged to be involved a couple of years back now in leading the lived experience contribution to the Lancet Commission on Self-Harm that was published in 2024. And so lived experience has always been part of what I do, but I'm increasingly focused on thinking about what that can do and what it brings to our understandings of self-harm, not just my lived experiences, but more broadly, being able to kind of harness the lived experiences of others, and for other supporting other researchers, practitioners, academics, scholars, activists, to be able to think carefully and critically with their lived experiences, but also to think about what they can do with that. Again, that's something perhaps we could talk more about in the question and answer section. So I'm going to move us gently into thinking about and with some of the data that I generated with those studies and that were shared and kind of worked through in my book. Two central problems that I'm going to be working through as we talk through this data. So firstly, that self-injury and self-harm are frequently positioned as being a private method of responding to challenging emotions. And then secondly, that self-injury or self-harm is also contentiously positioned as a method of communicating emotional distress. This is often framed, often through quite pejorative terms, such as in the UK, certainly, the idea of a cry for help, or most problematically, this idea of attention seeking. And attention seeking is never really framed or explained as being a good thing. It's usually something that is very bad and shameful and shouldn't be done, as we will see in terms of how that plays out in the data that I've generated. So when we're thinking, though, about emotions and self-injury, self-harm, in the work that I did, this early work, doing in-depth interviews with people who had experiences of self-harm, and then doing the kind of qualitative online survey and further interviews with much younger people about their experiences of self-harm, there are a number of different ways in which emotions are kind of came through in people's accounts, explanations, their ways of talking about self-injury to me, whether directly in a one-to-one interview or kind of secondhand through this online survey. So broadly, there are three kind of themes that have kind of came that I identified in how people talk about self-injury and emotions. So firstly, the idea that self-injury or self-harm might be a form of emotional release. Secondly, that it might be a form of emotional control. And then thirdly, that it might be a way of expressing emotions or emotional expression. So I'll illustrate this with a few excerpts or examples from some of the interviews that I did. So Craig, who was one of the people that I spoke with in 2007, talked about his self-harm as being a way of trying to get some kind of overload of emotion out. And this sense that self-injury or self-harm is kind of a response to overwhelming and overload, something that can't otherwise be expressed, is a common feature of many people's accounts. Harriet similarly talks about a need to do it, and this is often accounted for or narrated as being a need to relieve tension. It's something that is effective in that sense. And then finally, Lacey's, who was one of the younger people who contributed to the 2014 study, says, I've done it out of stress or anxiety to calm myself when I'm incredibly emotional or upset. So there's this sense here then that self-injury or self-harm is being accounted for and explained by many participants as being a way of releasing or relieving emotions that are felt otherwise somehow overwhelming or difficult to contain. Emotional control is a parallel related way, though, in which people have talked about the relationship between self-injury, self-harm and emotions. So Jay, speaking to me in 2014 in an interview, says that when my self-harm started, it was definitely a way of getting back at them, getting the anger out and regaining control type thing. And so this notion of kind of releasing or relieving emotions through self-harm, but that this being a way of regaining control and being in control, is an important feature of many people's accounts of self-harm. As I talk through these, though, I do want to kind of just acknowledge that I'm giving kind of excerpts here and examples. And in most cases, when people are talking about or working through their ideas and experiences of self-harm as part of a research interview, there isn't just one explanation or way of understanding self-harm. So these are features of people's accounts, but they're not the totality of it. People often have quite complex, messy accounts of how they make sense of and understand self-harm. And in many cases, people very explicitly use research interviews in order to explore what happened to them, why they do these things. It's not always clear. This kind of exploratory approach is one that I absolutely share, and throughout my own engagement with researching self-injury and self-harm, I continue to reflect on my own experiences. There aren't clear reasons often, but we can find clues and hints. So Jane, also speaking to me in 2014, says, I need to be in control of something when I can't control myself. And here we have some of the kind of hints of things that I'll come back to around the role of bodies here, and this sense of things are out of control. We can ask questions here about what is out of control with people's lives. And when people feel out of control, self-injury is framed and claimed here then as being a way of gaining or regaining control over things that are felt to be out of control. Those things may be the internal or felt to be internal emotional states of the person who is self-harming, but it might also be aspects of the worlds around them. I want to kind of draw attention here to particularly the younger age of many people when they start self-harming and the levels of control that young people especially have over their everyday lives, which can often be relatively limited when parents have ultimate control, teachers may have more control, and so on. We'll perhaps come back to this. So another way in which people draw on ideas about emotions when they're accounting for or talking about their self-harm is through this notion of emotional expression. So Frances here provides us an example of how this plays out in some of the interviews. Frances said to me in 2007, I felt I was incapable of feeling anything, incapable of emotion. And I didn't like that. I wanted to be able to feel, I wanted to, live or experience stuff. And so self-harming was, a way of feeling pain because it was something. So what we have here is that rather than a sense of emotional overwhelm or overload, as some of the earlier accounts that I shared kind of referred to, and instead we have Frances here talking about feeling nothing, feeling that this wasn't right, feeling that, and Frances was really clear with me in his interview at this time, that there was a lot going on in his life. Yeah, there were sort of family problems, there were challenges happening that he felt he should be feeling bad about, but he was feeling nothing. And so for him, at this point at least, self-harm was something, as he said, a way of feeling pain because it was something, as a way to try and instigate some way of feeling something. So this is a slightly different approach to that shared by Belinda, who talked here more explicitly about the way in which she used self-injury to try and express emotions. She says, I never outwardly express anger. In particular, she was talking about here. I sort of just suppress it, then go for a walk or something to get rid of it, and then deal with the situation. She said, but then at that time, when she was at a point where she was self-harming a lot, at that time, well, it must have been at 17 or 18, and then when there was a bit of anger in with it as well, and I'd get angry at myself and at them, and here she refers to her parents, and just, I don't know why I didn't know what to do with it, so that's why I cut that. So here there's a sense that there is an emotion that is being felt, but Belinda doesn't know what to do with it. She's struggling to know how to outwardly express it. Again, I want to kind of flag here the contexts that Belinda and Frances are both referring to, and these are interpersonal kind of like family contexts that were experienced as challenging. Belinda here is talking about feeling that she didn't know how to deal with a situation, she didn't know how to express her anger, and this is an important feature that, again, we'll come back to. So I want to talk then briefly about the emotional contexts or cultural contexts in which self-injury and emotions take place, and to kind of pick up some of the threads that I've begun to start weaving with you through these earlier accounts about how emotions are coming out in these accounts of self-harm or self-injury. So there are features I would suggest across each of these different ways that emotions are coming out that speak to ideas about emotional repression, the idea that emotions are kept inside and are not expressed, but also emotional invalidation, the idea that emotions in particularly these younger people or people reflecting on their younger years, their emotions are not being recognised or given space for within particularly familial contexts. And I want to point here then to something that we might want to think more about the available cultural scripts people have in order to both talk about their emotions and their self-harm, but also to actually experience and express those in their day-to-day lives. So in particular, I'm going to draw here on two particularly kind of Eurocentric, European expressions or ways of thinking about particularly emotional repression and the idea that emotions should be, especially strong negative emotions, should not be shared. Feelings of pain should be kept inside and should be suffered in silence. So firstly, this is a quote from the Bible, which is not necessarily a text that I have spent a huge amount of time with, but it is kind of UK culture, which is where all of these interviews are broadly from, is infused, even if it is a largely secular society now. A lot of British culture is infused with Christianity, ultimately. And this comes then from Isaiah 53:7. And here it says, he was oppressed, he was afflicted, and yet he opened not his mouth. He's brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. This kind of refers, or I would suggest, and you may disagree, people can disagree with me, I would suggest this speaks to a broad kind of cultural kind of feature of British society, which privileges keeping our mouths closed when we are in pain and when we are facing danger. There's an expression in the UK which is called the stiff upper lip, the idea that we kind of stay emotionless in the face of challenge. And this is reflected also in this quote from Friedrich Schiller. So this is a German writer or author or dramatist from a play called Don Carlos, where this quote, great souls suffer or endure, depending on the translation, in silence, again speaks to this. And I could use lots and lots of other examples, but what I'm trying to speak to here is the role in which how our emotions are experienced and expressed, how they're responded to by others, is a deeply social and cultural feature. It's not something that we can, I would say, strip down to kind of biological imaginaries or kind of understanding emotions in a kind of clinical sense. I think we have to attend to the social and cultural contexts, both in terms of that small interpersonal level, how are families, which I'll come to, but also this kind of broader cultural scripts or ideas about the appropriate and inappropriate ways in which we can do or express or feel emotions. So I'll talk a bit more now about how some of these emotional contexts play out. Francis, who I spoke about earlier, referred quite explicitly to the role of his kind of like family's kind of own kind of interior cultures of doing emotions or not doing emotions, as it were. So Francis talked here about his own resistance to the idea of seeing a counsellor. So he was experiencing challenging feelings. He had begun to self-harm. He kind of recognised this in himself as something, a sign that something was wrong. However, he said that the idea of seeing a counsellor, especially at that time in his teenage years, was very difficult to kind of countenance. He suggested that his family's culture of thinking about emotions, sharing and seeking emotional or psychological support was like really one that this was dismissed. He said it sort of gives you room for self-indulgence really, or feeling sorry for yourself. Whereas if, you sort of roll with the punches, play it down, which he said is sort of my family's kind of thing. In a different way, Belinda also spoke to the role of her family and the way in which that shaped her experiences and ideas about emotion, and particularly her own resistance to feeling or expressing, in particular, the emotion of anger. She said, my dad gets very angry very quickly, and I never want to ever be that way. So for Belinda, she drew on in her account with me anyway, this idea that for her emotion was anger was an emotion that was an unpleasant one. It was one that she had witnessed and experienced from her father, didn't want to kind of replicate that herself. So for her, self-injury was a way of dealing with that challenge. speaks then to ideas about how emotional states within families might be or become repressed or invalidated. Now, what I want to really point out here is that, of course, there is one approach to thinking about the emotional dynamics within families that might take a psychological or psychiatric perspective. I'm sure that many people who have experiences with self-harm, self-injury, and indeed eating disorders may have gone into therapeutic situations where the family becomes the focus. What I want to really just underline here, though, is that families do not exist in a vacuum. They are themselves part of broader social and cultural worlds, which themselves have cultural ideas and practices and ways of doing emotions, which may indeed further shape these contexts. So to kind of further extend this, others have kind of referred to the way in which knowledge about self-injury and the kind of emotional aspects of that have responded to within the family and within family contexts. So Katie, who was in her teens when she took part in the 2014 study, referred to this explicitly. She said, "My mum knows the main bits of what's going on, but I don't tell her all the details. And if she ever finds anything out, 90% of the time, the school is involved in that." Now, this points to a couple of interesting features, I think, both in terms of that there is a sense that normatively Katie is sharing things with her mother, but not all of the details. And when details are found out, it's because school has found out and school tells Katie's mom without Katie's knowledge. We think back to the points I was raising earlier about how much control young people have over their lives and over what is or is not shared about them. So families throughout the different studies that I've done are often described as knowing about self-injury, but that communication about self-injury or about whatever kind of emotional, interpersonal or other things might be happening around the experiences of those who are self-injuring, communication about any of that is limited. Emma, talking to me in 2007, was reflecting a lot with me about the ways that her family had dealt with her experiences with self-harm and more broadly with mental distress and psychiatric treatment across several years. So Emma was 37 when I spoke to her. She was one of the older people that I spoke with back in that first study. But she says, that's kind of the way in my family. Nothing is talked about. So she talked about a period of time after she had been admitted to hospital following through accident and emergency, following a fairly significant act of self-injury and self-harm, and that afterwards nothing was talked about. She went to stay with her parents after this, and they, played Scrabble together, which is a board game, but didn't actually ask her what was going on, how she was doing. So silences were a kind of prevailing feature of many of the people that I've spoken to across the different studies, prevailing feature of their experiences of how self-injury is responded to within family contexts. So this brings me again back to this sense of this idea of the broader cultural context that might shape what is going on within families where there are challenging emotional dynamics and then silencing responses when self-injury becomes apparent. So Dinah, speaking to me in 2007, talked about what she saw as a peculiarly Scottish culture. So Scotland is actually the part of the UK that I am based in, and indeed that a lot of my research has been based in. Dinah refers to this as a Scottish culture, British culture. You're keeping things to yourself and not wanting to worry other people. So this idea of suffering in silence and keeping things in, Dinah kind of explicitly referred to here. Similarly, Millie suggested, and this was an interesting one because I think what Millie argues here is that society these days is just so one must not show one's emotions to the world kind of thing. Now, this is obviously back in 2007, which is now almost 20 years ago, which is just crazy. But I think there are some interesting kind of developments that were happening around the time that I spoke with Millie actually, and I talked about this with colleagues at the time, that although Millie was arguing here that there was a societal idea that you shouldn't show your emotions, actually at the same time there have been shifts in sort of broadly like Anglophone English-speaking worlds at least, and again it'd be really interesting to hear how this parallels elsewhere, where actually people are increasingly showing their emotions far more than they certainly used to in the kind of earlier 20th century. So the 21st century has been kind of characterized by certainly some types of emotional expression being perhaps more common. So it's interesting that for Millie and her experience, that was very much not how she explained it or understood it. So Reese similarly talks about this idea of not wanting to burden other people, including my friends, with any of my problems. So this speaks to wider cultural scripts and rules about emotional expression and their existence. So again, I would argue it is impossible to understand self-injury and self-harm and how they're experienced and how that plays out in interpersonal relationships with families and friends without attending to the way in which emotional expression itself is cultural, is social. I want to flag as well that many of the accounts that I have heard across the years tend to privilege a kind of idea of emotions as somehow troubling. Emotional states are something that need to be controlled, that shouldn't be shared, that are somehow difficult. And this, I have argued, speaks to a privileging of the idea of a rational person and the idea that rationality doesn't involve emotions. So emotions are allowed, but within significant constraints. There are proper ways of experiencing emotions and expressing them. And what I would suggest, I've identified across many studies, particularly those here, but subsequently also, is this idea that particularly strong negative emotions, such as anger, are somehow felt to be impossible to experience, and if not particularly to express.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the audio has a problem. I can't hear anything suddenly. Thank you.
왜 이렇게 됐지? 죄송합니다. 제 계정이 음소거가 됐었던 것 같아요. 잠깐만요.
People feel out of control. Self-injury is framed and claimed here then as being a way of gaining or regaining control over things that are felt to be out of control. Those things may be the internal or felt to be internal emotional states of the person who is self-harming, but it might also be aspects of the worlds around them. I want to kind of draw attention here to particularly the younger age of many people when they start self-harming and the levels of control that young people especially have over their everyday lives, which can often be relatively limited.
잠깐만요. 잠깐만요.
저는 잘 들립니다.
아, 네, 영상이 중간에 제가 다시 틀었는데 너무 앞부분으로 들어갔던 것 같아요. 네. 여기서부터 다시 시작할게요.
Accounts of self-injury speak often to a great deal of blurring and speaking to the interconnection and embodied nature of our lives and our experiences and our feelings. So Millie suggested that for her practice of self-injury involved having a physical pain to deal with, and that was easier than dealing with the pain that she said you couldn't put your finger on. So this spoke to an idea of emotional pain as being something that was harder to articulate, harder to really kind of do anything with. Whereas for her, self-injury was more tangible. She could see it, she could feel it. So similarly, Belinda spoke to this also. She says, I know it's real and it's there and it's concrete. My arm hurts, it's bleeding, it's a feeling instead of just the confusion and not understanding things. And it's trying to make sense of something, of whatever's in my head, to make it something understandable and manageable. Again, I think that each of these accounts potentially speaks to an idea of privileging rationality and of being able to explain. This sense of not understanding is experienced or indicated here by Belinda to be somehow unmanageable, that she couldn't make sense of it. And for her, self-injury gave her something that was more concrete, more real. Now, interestingly, in relation to thinking about accounts of emotions and bodies and self-harm, one of the things that I identified across particularly the accounts of younger people that I spoke to or generated discussions with through online surveys, drew on some interesting ways of talking about their bodies in relation to making sense of emotions and self-harm. So Sarah, for instance, writing in 2014, she said, at first I was trying to display the pain that I felt on the inside onto the outside. So this idea of, again, similar to Belinda, similar to Millie, kind of just having something to see that was visible. But she says that then I became addicted and I couldn't stop. Now, this notion of addiction, of compulsion, of not being able to stop self-injury is something that came out particularly in the 2014 kind of accounts with young people. It's a strong way in which self-harm is accounted for by some people, but not by all. And it's a way, I would suggest, in which kind of medical or clinical language kind of seeps into how self-injury and self-harm is understood. In a different kind of vein, excuse the pun, Dean, also writing in 2014, wrote to me that he self-harms because I like to see the blood flow. So we have that sense again of seeing and visibility. He says it makes me happy, and then in brackets wrote endorphin release. Now, the idea of endorphins being part of what makes self-injury effective and how it shapes how we feel is a really, really fascinating one, because in terms of clinical literature, the evidence for the role of endorphins in self-harm is actually a little bit limited and a little bit contested, and I can talk more about why that is later. But what I want to draw attention to here is how it is used in people's accounts and ways of explaining their self-harm to other people. And this idea and use of clinical language or kind of biomedical imaginaries to try and explain and make sense of self-harm to me, to a researcher, but also to others. Again, I would suggest this in some senses is a kind of idea of trying to rationalize self-harm, to explain it as, well, there's a biological reason why this helps, that is somehow seen as perhaps more tangible, perhaps more believable. Which brings us to the tricky notion of attention seeking and the idea of self-harm as authentic or inauthentic. Now, this is a tricky area, and I want to kind of draw here on an account from Greta, who spoke with me in 2014. She was 14 at the time, and here Greta speaks about this notion of attention seeking. She wrote to me, I think of it like this: if you don't really know them and you know they're self-harming, it's for attention. If they talk about it openly in front of everyone, it's for attention. She said, but not everybody's doing it to get people's attention. Now, this idea of self-harm or self-injury as attention-seeking, and that being framed very pejoratively, the idea that, very rarely is it not framed pejoratively. It's usually framed as a bad thing if somebody is self-injuring for attention. This came up in the accounts of the people I spoke to back in 2007, came up again in 2014. It continues to be, certainly in the United Kingdom, in terms of kind of cultural discourses about self-harm, a really strong way in which self-harm is understood and understood negatively. There's a sort of sense here that self-harm, as Greta speaks to here, that if self-harm is hidden, if it's kept private, if nobody knows about it, then that's okay somehow. But if everybody knows about it, then it's for attention, and that somehow then raises questions, which we'll come back to. So Marissa, also writing to me in 2014, she said that some people who self-harm do need attention, but unless they're flaunting their cuts or bruises or whatever everywhere, most of them are hiding it under long sleeves and such, and so they're not doing it for attention. Again, what Marissa sort of speaks to here is the idea that if people are self-harming, they should be hiding it. They shouldn't be flaunting it. But also she speaks to this trickiness that perhaps they do need attention. And this is, again, a common across kind of like self-harm activism in the UK, certainly. Arguments are often made that everybody needs attention. And so this is used to try and deflect this idea of self-injury as attention seeking and that being a bad thing. Of course, we all need attention. Marissa speaks here, though, to the kind of like the trickiness of this and how it might be experienced and read by other people. Which brings me to this notion of self-injuring authentically. So again, I want to draw attention here to the pejorative way in which self-harm for attention is often framed. And what I want to underline here is that this idea of self-harm as being inauthentic, if it's being done for attention, this doesn't come necessarily only from people who don't self-harm or self-injure, but also is something that is shared by people with experience of self-harm, perhaps as a way of trying to explain, make sense of their self-harm as authentic. So Leanne writes, there are a lot of fake self-harmers who make tiny cuts for attention. And this is clearly framed as a bad thing. Similarly, Leon says it's not to get attention, though. It's a way to cope when there isn't another way. So there are these kind of like ideas about attention, coping, what is and is not an authentic way of doing self-injury. Jay, who I spoke to as part of the 2014 study, spoke to me about this in some depth. So Jay says, I felt that I was expected to hide self-harm and that I should be doing it even if I didn't really mind about it. So Jay had this account that was a little bit more kind of confronting. She was really challenging this idea of negative ideas about attention seeking. She says, I felt like if I chose to take off a cardigan or whatever in the summer, that I was then somehow choosing to reveal cuts underneath and that was attention seeking, which she went on to say, which was obviously complete bullshit, but it was still a fear. So what Jay kind of speaks to here, and this speaks to the kind of importance of thinking about the body when we're thinking about self-harm and visibility, revealing or hiding, is that how self-injury or how self-harm might be read if it is made visible might not be the same as the intention of the person who could just be very warm and wants to take off their cardigan. But this idea, the circulating narrative of self-injury or self-harm as being potentially attention-seeking puts fear in this, even where, as Jay says, this is potentially, obviously, complete bullshit. So what I suggest this speaks to then are the idea of acceptable and unacceptable scripts through which we might narrate our self-injury. What I've spoken to and indicated throughout here is that there is an idea of self-injury or self-harm in an acceptable way that it is when it's used as a private method of managing strong negative emotions, and that this speaks to broader cultural narratives that privilege and prioritize the idea of having self-control, of being a rational person. What I suggest is that bodies here are integral and unavoidable. They are central to the practice of self-injury and how it is then explained to others and how it's experienced by those who have self-injured or self-harmed, particularly if we carry with us visible marks, whether they're recent or older, of our practice. So bodies are integral and avoidable and central, but what I'm suggesting and what the accounts of participants I've spoken to across time have suggested, bodies also need to be hidden, especially the visible kind of evidence of self-injury or self-harm. This notion then of attention seeking kind of is a spectre that kind of haunts, for want of a better word, many accounts of self-injury and many people's experiences of being in the world as a person with a self-injured or self-harmed body. Attention-seeking self-injury is framed as being, by many, a myth, but also at the same time framed as being something that other people do. There are silenced perspectives here, though. For instance, anybody who wants to wear short sleeves in the summer, or who feels, in fact, able to reveal their scars or cuts. So across certainly these early kind of studies that I did in 2007 and then 2014, there were occasional hints from some people who suggested that they actually, they were not interested in the idea of attention seeking, but they were also completely comfortable with the idea of having their self-injury visible. Those kinds of accounts, when we look at kind of more public accounts of self-harm as being a hidden issue, something that is invariably carried out in private, those more subversive or challenging accounts which reject that notion are very often kind of marginalised, silenced and not present. There are also, I think, some further unexamined perspectives which I continue to work with in my own work to really think about why the sight of self-injury particularly is so problematic to so many people. I think there are some really important areas here that I haven't finished thinking with about what it is that the kind of the visible signs of self-injury, particularly when it's recent and not an older scar. It's deeply unsettling, I think, to many people, to healthcare practitioners, to families, to friends. And I think there's a lot more work to be done there to explore what is happening there, to really question and work critically with those kind of experiences and ways of accounting for self-injured bodies. So, moving towards our end, because this has been a long talk. So self-injury then is increasingly, I suggest, read unproblematically as reflecting emotional distress and upset. This is despite broad encouragements that we see in mental health campaigning to talk more, to share our distress and emotional upheaval. What I suggest is that despite this, there are significant interpersonal, social and cultural barriers which kind of inhibit emotional expression, which frame particularly the expression of strong negative emotions, and particularly, we might add here, particularly the expression of strong negative emotions like anger among young women, which is something perhaps we can return to, that inhibit it and that therefore might kind of generate contexts where self-harm becomes more possible, more understandable. Both self-injury, I would suggest, and the experience of distress can be subject to charges of inauthenticity. In the book, I explore this in further detail, arguing that self-injury itself as a visible way of authenticating and showing our emotions, whether to ourselves or to other people, can be read and understood better if we also are aware that experiences of distress in general are often subject to dismissal or to charges of inauthenticity, or are you really feeling that bad? Or if it was that bad, you would have done something, which was something that Harriet shared with me back in 2007. So both self-injury and distress can be and are subject to charges of inauthenticity by others. The idea of people faking distress to get attention that is somehow framed then as not something that they are entitled to. Self-injury and expressions of distress are often framed as manipulative. And again, particularly, we can think about how people's social position, gender, age particularly, might shape whether or not somebody's expressions of distress, whether through self-harm or through attempting to talk about something, are being framed as manipulative. You can see I've got my lady crying in the background here, and the idea of tears being weaponized and framed as manipulative is one that is common circulating cultural narrative. Seeking attention then also being something that both self-injury and distress, expressions of distress, can often kind of invite charges of. So visible evidence of self-injury, I've suggested, is particularly challenging. I think there are a number of different ways we might understand this, and as I said, I think this is something that I'm thinking more with and continuing to. Visible self-injury is challenging because it signals distress. It is broadly read in that way. And I think that this can be challenging in part because of these cultural scripts and narratives that suggest that we should keep our distress to ourselves, avoid upsetting other people. So when self-injury is visible, it unsettles that. It's also tied to charges of inauthenticity. And particularly, I draw you back to those accounts from 2014, where people explicitly flagged that visible self-injury could be attention-seeking and therefore inauthentic. So could they be faking it? Why is it not hidden? If they were, real self-harmers, they would have hidden it, and I wouldn't be able to see it. Now, this leaves, of course, many who self-injure in a bit of a catch-22. There are also often unacknowledged but important visceral responses, disgust and horror, that remain unexplored and unchallenged. So I'm going to finish there. I've opened up perhaps some areas that we can talk through more. This is huge and complex, and I think I'd be really looking forward to reflecting more with this on this with Jeannie, with any of you who are listening. There were some references here, and you are very welcome to reach out and explore some of my work from the past and ongoing. Thank you very much.
감사합니다. 너무 잘 들었습니다. 어떠셨나요? 그러면 한 5분 쉬고서 질의응답 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 그동안에 질문거리들 한번 생각해 주세요. 그래서 이제 앞으로 8시 7분부터 질의응답을 시작하겠습니다. 번역해 주실 수 있나요, 소은님?
Hi, Amy. So we're going to take about a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll be back and start our session around 7 past.
슬슬 시작을 해볼까요? 제니님, 와, 질문 감사합니다. 어디 볼까요? 제니님께서 좀, 질문을 여기에 채팅창에 적어주셨는데요. 다른 분들도 질문을 목소리로 말씀으로 해주셔도 되고요. 아니면 이렇게 채팅창에 적어주셔도 괜찮습니다. 이거는 제니님 질문은 정말 너무 진짜 까다로운 어려운 질문인 것 같아요. 정말 임상에 관련된 현실적인 것들인데 한번 질문을 드려볼까요? 이게 좀 어려운 이론적인 것이라기보다는 현실적인 임상적인
네.
질문이라는 걸 말씀드리면서
네, 직접 겪은 일들이라.
네.
네.
아마 대처 방법에 대해서도 확실하게 이게 뭐 뭐라 그래야 될까? 정답은 없으시겠지만 대충
네, 네, 네.
의논을 할 수 있을 것 같네요.
네,
네.
제가 영어로 얘기해도 될까요?
네네네. 좋습니다.
네,
네네.
알겠습니다. Hi, Amy. I'm Jenny. And sorry, I don't know why, but my laptop is not turning on the camera. Sorry that I can't show my face. I don't know the reason. So I have three questions. And should I go one by one or just ask all three at once? Which way do you prefer?
I don't mind. It depends how easy they are to answer, doesn't it?
Okay. I would say it's very personal.
Okay,
So
okay.
thank you for your wonderful talk. And it was very inspiring and it helped me understand my loved ones. And the first question is my sister has bipolar disorder and she has many cutting scars for self-harming. And in the past, she had suicide attempts, so she had to be hospitalized too. So it's pretty severe. But nowadays, it seems like she's doing well. And we don't live together, so I don't see her often. And in general, she doesn't want to talk about these issues, about her symptoms or so on. But in case I realize a new scar or something that points out that she has self-harmed again, uh, I'm not sure how I should react because she doesn't like talking about her self-harm or bipolar and but I'm worried about her, so I don't want to like give her a feeling that I ignore her, but it's pretty challenging to approach this kind of situation. So that's my first question. And my second question is about my relative. Recently, he had a suicidal accident. The police officer caught him, so he is okay now, but I'm pretty worried about him. But I meet him only a couple times a year, so there's actually some nothing that I can do for him. But in case of this kind of relationship or situation, can you think about how I can help him? I don't have any ideas how to help him, but I want to, but don't know where to start. And the last question is, since my sister and my relatives have all these issues, I think my family has this kind of bloodstream. If in one day, if I live with one of my family members that have self-cutting issues, self-harm issues, or suicidal attempts, can you give me some practical advice, practical tips that I can make our home safer? For example, I an expert recommended window stopper, so the person cannot jump off the window, or hiding the knives in the safe so she can not harm herself, she or he cannot harm herself, something like that. So if I can be aware about those kinds of safety fences, I think that will be helpful in the future. I hope it doesn't become useful. I don't become in that situation, but I would like to know and be prepared. Thank you.
Sarah, shall I answer
Yes.
that? Yeah.
So I wrote the questions in Korean in the chat back.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so
That's great. And thank you. I am clearly linguistically challenged, and I wish I could speak to you all in a language that was not English, but I cannot. So thank you for the support with transcribing and translating. Okay, Jenny, there's a lot of things in your questions that I probably can't answer, actually. I guess I want to start with that as a starting point in terms of, thinking about how your sister and how your other family member how you could best support them. I'm definitely not the best person to answer that question, unfortunately. I guess one of the things that I've learned through many years of speaking to people with different experiences with self-harm and with suicide is just how different they are. So what might work for one person, what might be experienced as a really supportive response for one person might be experienced by somebody else as really intrusive and unpleasant. Which really isn't very helpful when it comes to offering advice in terms of how to support people from for you and from your perspective. I think the only thing that I would suggest in relation to that, and I guess I'm thinking about your sister here, about how to broach the subject, would be, I guess, to start from a position of being interested and showing that you're willing to listen. Whilst at the same time not pushing a conversation, because obviously for some people it can be really hard to talk about. I'm really conscious, and again, this is something that I have to be really careful about, that I'm really used to talking about self-injury and self-harm now because I do it as a job. I'm thinking about it and talking about it all the time. But actually, for many, many people, it's still really, really difficult to talk about, or it can be. And again, this is where it can just vary a lot depending on the person. Some people are more or less comfortable about it. So I guess showing your sister that you are, and again, that's a big assumption, if you are comfortable to talk about it, can be a starting point. But also, I guess, to recognize that you might not be. And actually, for myself, when I have also had family members and friends that have self-harmed, and actually it's really hard to talk about sometimes, especially if it's something that is quite recent. And sort of indicates that things aren't going well, then it can be just really hard. So just doing as much as possible to be there as a person that can be spoken to, so that it's not seen, so that you're doing what you can to kind of open up a space where silence isn't needed, even though it might be what is preferred by the person. Again, really, really hard to offer advice there, because it's so different for different people. And again, in terms of your relative that's had the kind of suicidal accident, as you put it, recently, and how you can help, again, being open that you're able to be there to be, as a person to speak to, that you're not going to judge them about it. I think one of the sort of the main things that I guess is perhaps held in common across lots of different people's experiences with trying to kind of reach out, seek help, or get support from others, is the importance of not, of getting a response from somebody else, especially from a loved one, but actually really from anybody, a medical professional or person that you encounter, of not being judged for what's happened. So people who self-harm or experience suicidal thoughts or actions often do feel a great deal of shame in relation to what's happened, and that's related to broader stigmas and so on. And taboo, in the sense that these things should be hidden. So being clear that, for you, that isn't an issue, that you're open to that. But again, that's going to really depend a great deal on your family member. And I obviously don't know them.
Thank you.
And then I'll finally come to the question about practical tips to make a home safer. So this is a really interesting one. It raises a lot of questions for me. I think there are certainly certain things that you might want to consider around kind of the window blocks, window stoppers, and getting rid of visible sharp objects for sure. But I think one thing that, again, based on conversations I've had over many years with different people, would be about kind of involving the person that you're trying to keep safe in those conversations, so that it's part of a kind of collaborative discussion about things that you might do to make a place safer for them, in part so that they are involved and feel some sense of control over what's happening, you know, so that you're not kind of taking control from them, you're involving them in those conversations. And also because the ways that people can harm themselves are very, very multiple and varied. And so whatever you tried to do, if you didn't involve a person in that conversation, you might well miss things that they would know about. But again, it is also about having that respectful, collaborative conversation with somebody so that you're working together to keep them safe, or to help them be safer, recognizing that complete safety might be actually impossible. So I hope that's helpful, but there's all sorts of issues that it raises, I think. But it's great that you're thinking through these things, and asking those questions. And I'm sorry that there aren't any really straightforward and easy answers, because I think it is tricky, and it's very diverse in terms of people's experiences. So it's hard to give advice that kind of fits all boxes, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions.
Having the person in the conversation while making the home safer, I think that's a very important point that I didn't think of. Like, instead of just installing a window blocker, what suddenly, without him or her knowing it, might make them feel that I'm trying to control something that, and she's not part of it. I think that's a very great advice. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Sorry that the camera is off.
That's okay. No worries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
저도 같은 생각이에요. 너무 중요한 점을 지적해 주신 것 같아요. 혹시 소호님 요약해 주실 수 있나요?
네, 잠깐 요약드리겠습니다. 우선 아까 제니님께서 총 세 가지의 이제 질문을 던져주셨고, 첫 번째는 이제 동생분 이제 자해 경험에 관해서 이제 질문하셨고, 결국 이 에이미 선생님께서 이제 강조하신 부분은 이 개인과 이제 개별적 경험이 너무나 다르기 때문에 실질적 조언을 주는 거가 조금 조심스럽긴 하지만, 이제 본인이 조언을 준다면, 이제 첫 번째 이제 질문에 대해서는 우리가 이제 이러한 자해 충동을 갖고 있는 가족인을 대할 때 우리가 이제 오픈되어 있는 자세를 가지고 있다는 거를 이제 표출하는 게 중요할 것 같다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 이러한 자해에 대한 이제 주제를 논의를 할 때 우리가 관심을 가지고 있고 경청의 자세를 이제 표하는 것, 그리고 이제 사실 이 에이미 선생님 같은 분은 자해나 자살에 대한 거가 이제 업으로 삼고 계신 분이기 때문에 이런 걸 이야기하는 거가 뭔가 무겁거나 아니면 이게 다가가는 게 어렵진 않지만, 그렇지 않은 분들도 많기 때문에 이런 대화 자체를 여는 거를 시작하는 게 중요하겠다라고 이제 말씀을 이제 주셨고요. 그다음에 두 번째 친척의 이제 자살 사고에 대한 부분에 대해서 코멘트를 주셨는데, 이제 두 번째 질문에 대해서 이 같은 경우에도 이제 1번 질문과 비슷한 맥락으로 이제 그들을 우리가 편견으로 바라보고 있는 것이 아니라 도움을 주고 싶어 하고 그다음에 들어주고 싶어 하는 자세를 가지고 있다라는 걸 적극적으로 표현하는 게 중요한 자세이겠다고 했습니다. 더군다나 이게 중요한 이유는 많은 분들이 특히나 이제 그런 이제 그 shame 또는 스티그마를 이제 갖고 계시기 때문에 편견 없이 우리 듣고 있다라는 걸 조금 이제 강조를 하셨고요. 마지막으로 그러면 이제 자해 충동을 이제 가지고 있는 이제 가족 인원들과 우리가 같이 살 때 이들을 이제 실질적으로 어떠한 팁들을 이제 뭐 가정 내에서 이제 우리가 실행할 수 있는지에 대해서 좀 질문을 주셨고, 그거에 대한 답변은 예를 들어서 여기 이제 질문 주신 거 보면은 뭐 창문을 완전히 안 열리게 한다거나 윈도우 스토퍼 같은 장치들을 우리가 둘 수 있지만, 그러한 장치들을 둘 때 이 그 자해 충동을 가지고 있는 가족 구성원을 같이 그 대화에 참여시키는 것이 중요하다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 그들부터 우리가 이제 안전을 같이 우리는 지키기 위해서 대화를 하는 거고, 같은 회복의 일환이고, 그들을 통제를 하려고 하는 것이 아니라 안전이 조금 더 중요한 부분이다라고 하셔서 그 대화에 참여시키는 거가 조금 중요한 자세이겠다라는 게 좀 중요한 메시지였던 것 같습니다.
저는 이 질의응답에서 생각했던 게, 에이미 교수님이 말씀하신 것 중에서는 자해에 대한 이야기를 자기 당사자가 아니라 그 주변에 있는 사람들이 하는 것을 꺼려한다는 점을 지적해 주셨는데 어떻게 보면 또 자해하는 당사자 입장에서도 얘기를 하는 게 꺼려질 수도 있겠구나라는 생각이 들었고요. 그리고 제일 마지막에 컨트롤 이슈 제기될 수도 있는 상황은 정말 너무 공감이 갔습니다. 네.
감사합니다.
그리고 지금 김관욱 교수님이 참석을 해주셨는데요. 석성여대 인류학과 교수님이 질문을 여기 채팅창에 써주셨어요. 소은님 혹시 이게 지금 에이미 교수님이 해주신 연구들은 어린 친구들에 관한 연구인데
네.
어린 시절의 그 셀프함 경험이 좀 나이 들어서의 또 다른 양상이 셀프함으로 어떻게 연결되는지에 대해서 질문하신 것 같은데 이거에 대해서 이 질문을 풀어서 전달해
네.
주실 수 있을까요?
네. Hi, Amy. So we have another question popped up on the chat box. It's from Professor Kim. He is a professor of medical and anthropology. So the key point of this question is the big bulk of your research comes from young female adults in terms of their self-injury. And the question is, when they head into their 50s and later on in their life, how does that form of self-injury is transformed and how is that shown in so for example, is it a different type of self-harm, and does it often resemble the types of self-injury that used to do in their teenage years? So the transformation of female adulthood self-injury, how does that look different or similar in their later years? And is it also part of the research? I think that's the question. Yeah.
Sorry, what was the last bit again, Sarah?
Oh, I think it was also asking, is that also part of your research as well, looking into women in later life?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for that question. It's a really interesting one. So I guess firstly, although about between 50% and 70% of my research participants are female, between a third and a half of them are male. I would say across the different studies. So I have actually done a reasonable amount of research that actually involves men and men's accounts as well. But there is obviously a huge focus on women's self-harm in broader discourse. I'm not sure what the statistics look like in South Korea, but in the United Kingdom, the official statistics suggest that rates of self-harm are especially high among young women, and that rate has risen recently as well. So that's obviously really interesting, and especially that question then of what happens as people age through. There's very little research that follows people through across a long period of time. There's one study that I'm aware of that did suggest that for young people who self-harmed in their kind of teenage years and early 20s, most of them had stopped self-harming by the time they got to the age of 30. Now, that's just one study, and it was a kind of survey-based study. It's reasonably limited, I would say, in relation to how well that will reflect broader kind of populations of people that self-harm. And there's a number of reasons I kind of want to raise queries about that. So one of them is that it relates to the kind of what is self-harm question. And I think that sort of sense of to what extent does self-harm change over time? Is it possible that practices such as self-cutting or burning get replaced with other approaches or methods of self-harm? I think some of the research that I've done with slightly older groups of people, so people who are in their kind of like mid to late 30s, even into their 40s, suggests that for some people, practices of self-harm are replaced by alcohol and drug use, exercise, controlling eating, and kind of like managing bodies in different ways. So I think that it would be really interesting, and I haven't done this, to look specifically at kind of groups of older people who perhaps self-injured through self-cutting, burning, etc. in their younger years, and to look at their perspectives about that, how that kind of has played out across their life courses. there's very little research, as far as I'm aware, that's looked at older age groups. One small study that I'm aware of that looked at much older people, so people in their sort of 70s and 80s, and looked at their kind of accounts of self-harm. That's some work led by Isabella Troyer, whose PhD research was specifically on much older age groups, but that looked at people who were largely taking overdoses, again, in their older years, although some of them self-injured as well. So again, this is such an interesting topic, so I'm going to try and stop talking because I'm aware you're going to have to perhaps translate this. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting and important question. In short, there isn't a great deal of research. There's some bits of my work that does speak to some really interesting things there that I think really would benefit from further study. There you go. Thanks.
네, 좀 말씀을 드리면 우선 에이미 이제 선생님의 연구는 한 3분의 2 정도는 여성 환자들 대상으로 하고 있고 나머지 한 3분은 남자분들 되고 있고 대부분 여성들 중에 좀 젊은 여성분들 리서치를 많이 하고 있어서 본인은 지금 직접적으로 중년 여성 이상 정도에 되는 그 여성분들에서는 연구를 하고 있지는 않다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그리고 또 특히나 이 영역에서의 이 어릴 적 자해 경험이 이제 나랑 중년에 어떻게 이게 발전되는가에 대한 부분도 많이 부재하고 있는 주제라고 말씀하셨고요. 본인이 알기로는 지금 한 가지 연구가 떠오른다고 말씀을 해주셨고, 그 연구 같은 경우에는 대부분의 이제 청소년기의 자해나 이제 자살 충동 이제 이러한 셀프 인저리를 인플렉트했던 환자들이 한 30살 정도가 되면은 그 셀프함을 멈춘다는 연구가 있었다고 합니다. 그래서 물론 이 연구 자체도 뭔가 제한적이기도 하고 서베이 위주였기 때문에 이게 대다수의 이제 사람들을 이제 잘 이렇게 보여준다라고 말하기는 어렵지만 이제 본인이 봤을 때는 이제 아마 30살 이후에는 다른 양상이 나타날 거고 대부분 이제 우리가 알기로는 약물 중독이나 아니면 알코올 사용 또는 이제 운동, 다른 형태의 이제 몸을 다루는 것으로 아마 셀프함이 대체가 되는 것 같다라고 우리는 한번 생각해 볼 수 있다고 말씀해 주셨고요. 그래서 이 주제를 우리가 논의할 때 물론 아직 연구가 많이 없는 것도 있겠지만 중요하게 우리가 던져야 할 질문은 셀프함에 대한 이제 정의를 다시 한번 생각해 볼 필요가 있고 셀프 커팅이라는 거가 그럼 다르게 어떻게 대체되는 것인가가 조금 연구가 추가로 필요하겠다라고 말씀 주셨습니다. 그리고 또 마지막으로 본인이 떠오르는 연구 중에 하나는 이제 영국에서 다른 한 연구자가 이제 70세 이상 되는 이제 노년 인구 대상으로 이 자해 충동에 대해서 연구를 했었고 그 그 연구에 들어갔던 대상의 사람들은 대부분 다 이제 약물 중독 관련이기 때문에 아직까지 그냥 중요한 질문이긴 하지만 아직까지는 많이 없다라는 게 조금 에이미 선생님의 말씀이었던 것 같습니다. 네.
그렇네요. 저 또한 당사자 경험이 있는 사람으로서 커팅이 유효한 나이대가 있는 것 같아요. 네. 제가 드리고 싶은 질문도 있는데 저는 뭐 이미 에이미 선생님께 언급도 하긴 했지만 너무 놀라운 사실이 특히 영국도 그렇지만 아일랜드랑 스코틀랜드는 왜 이렇게 정부 정책이 혁신적이고 급진적일까요? 너무 부러운데 섭식장애 정책이 호주에서 되게 급진적인 것처럼 스코틀랜드랑 아일랜드는 너무나 너무 부러울 정도로 정부 정책이 혁신적인 거예요. 특히 스코틀랜드 같은 경우는 최근에 자살 예방 정책 새로 나온 것도 있었고 제가 그 부분을 얘기하면서 에이미 선생님 같은 이런 자살이나 자해 연구자들의 연구가 정책에 어떻게 반영되는지를 여쭸더니 그뿐만 아니라 자해 관련 정책도 나왔는데 직접 참여를 하셨다고 답을 해주시더라고요. 근데 우리나라 같은 경우는 뭐 당사자가 참여하는 경우는 절대 없을 뿐더러 가장 최근의 과학적인 발견이 반영되는 경우도 거의 없잖아요. 자살 예방 정책 같은 경우는 모든 게 다 자살 시도하는 사람들은 다 우울증 환자인 것처럼 치부하고 그리고 결과적으로 뭐 핫라인이라든가 힘든 걸 털어놓으세요, 뭐 상담하세요라고 막 그런 메시지밖에 보내지 않는 실정인데 그거에 반하면 너무나도 되게 체계적이고 네, 그런 접근법을 취하고 있어서 이런 연구자들의 연구가 어떻게 펀딩되고 어떻게 정책으로 들어가고 어떻게 리브드 익스피리언스가 참여가 독려되는지 이런 점들 한번 여쭤보고 싶어요.
Right. So this was a question from Jeannie, Amy. So I think this is more like the commentary on how well advanced and radical the current policy shaping around the discourse for self-harm and suicide prevention is, especially in Scotland and Ireland. So from as what you said was in Korea, there's a huge gap when it comes to talking about suicide prevention policies, and rarely recent research or participations of lived experienced people join as part of making those policies. So she pointed out that she was very surprised to see that, especially in Scotland, in their recent bill for suicide prevention and self-harm, a lot of research, including your research, was also involved. So her question was more on how are these research funded and how is your research represented and what was that journey like? And why is it so systematically well placed in places like Scotland and in Ireland? And perhaps that could also help us to guide to shape our policies in Korea. So more of a practical questions on how you did it, basically. Yeah.
Okay. I will try and answer. It's a great question because I think, and it's actually one that, so some of the research that I'm doing currently with others, so I've got a team of people that work with me now at Edinburgh. We're funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is a kind of a research funder that focuses on medicine and health in the United Kingdom, but actually has a sort of strand of work that funds explicitly like interdisciplinary work and has generally quite good values and focuses on the importance of lived and living experience inclusion. So they funded 2 of my projects in recent years. And one of the things that we're doing with my current project, which is called Discovering Livability, is actually asking these questions about policies around suicide prevention in the United Kingdom, especially. We're kind of trying to understand why it is that actually in Scotland, especially, but also, as you mentioned, Ireland, there is, and increasingly actually in Wales, which is another part of the United Kingdom, there is a focus on the importance of lived and living experiences of suicide in kind of informing and guiding policy and strategy around suicide prevention. Now, that is also present to some extent in England and Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, but it's less present, it's less evident. We're trying to work out why that is, and we don't actually know currently. So I think in Scotland, in terms of my experiences and the kind of opportunities I've had to be able to inform policy and policy making there, it's definitely not just on me. Scotland's quite a small country. There's around 5.5 million people. The university I work in is the University of Edinburgh, and that's in the same city that the Scottish Parliament is based. So a lot of health policy is devolved to the kind of devolved nations. So Scotland has its own parliament, its own, it makes its own sort of policies around suicide prevention. And we've got quite good relationships with the policymakers. They come along to our events and have done over many years. And there's been really good links between academics doing research on suicide and self-harm and the Scottish kind of government and policymakers. And so I've been really fortunate to be kind of able to be part of those conversations. And that's, I think, definitely helped. But I think it's not that alone. There's also really sort of strong kind of survivor and service user-led kind of like organising and activism in Scotland that, again, has quite a long history. And that means, I think, that Scottish policymakers are, again, they're used to listening to people speaking from lived and living experience. And so kind of way back when I was still quite early in my career, the Scottish government made a decision, and again, based very much on sort of survivor and service user kind of activism, they made a decision to separate the self-harm and suicide prevention strategies from each other, largely because of lots of people with experience of self-harm saying that their experiences with self-harm were nothing to do with suicide, and B, that the idea of preventing self-harm could lead to kind of really kind of coercive, damaging healthcare practices that took away agency and control from people and actually could make things worse. The Scottish government and the policymakers at that time listened, and they took away self-harm. So the England's suicide prevention strategy includes self-harm prevention, for instance. In Scotland, we have a separate policy on self-harm now that does not. It centres reduction because we want to reduce distress and pain. But it does not specifically aim to prevent self-harm. And again, that is based on a lot of listening to people who have experiences with self-harm, and the sense that actually if you remove people's control and power and try and just stop them doing something, actually you may make things worse. So that is a very rambling answer. I'm sorry, Sarah. But I mean, ultimately, I think we're still trying to work out why it is, but I think partly it is around the sort of the smallness, the openness to listening. And again, one final thing I suppose is that across the UK, the United Kingdom, there's an increasing kind of at least lip service being paid to listening to people with lived experience. Mm-hmm. The extent to which that actually plays out in terms of changing policies varies. And I would say as well, a final point is that even in Scotland, where we have, as you know, quite a radical approach to it, and there is a radical centering of lived experience, how much power those with lived experience have in actually shaping the policy and then what happens in practice, all of that is not as straightforward, so and that's something that we're still continuing to explore. Actually, we might have a great policy, but that might not change how people experience healthcare if they turn up at A&E, for instance. People still often get really negative experiences in those places. So, okay, sorry, Sarah, over to you.
That's absolutely fine, Amy. 우선 제가 이제 이해한 말씀을 드리면, 지금 현재 에이미 이제 선생님께서는 이제 본인이 팀이 이제 꾸려지고 있다고 합니다. 그래서 특히 이제 스코틀랜드 웰컴 트러스트라고 하는 이 약간 다학제적으로 이제 여러 가지 의료 문제를 대해서 논의를 하는 그러한 이제 펀딩의 기금이 있다고 하고요. 그래서 그 기금을 통해서 이러한 연구들을 잘 이루어오실 수가 있었던 거였고, 특히 이제 스코틀랜드 같은 경우 이제 워낙 이제 영국 내에서도 이제 여러 가지 나라가 있지만 스코틀랜드 같은 경우에서는 오래전부터 시민단체들 같은 활동가들의 이제 의견을 듣는 문화가 조금 예전보다 자리 잡혀 있었다고 합니다. 그리고 이제 그런 거와 이제 비슷하게도 아카데미아와 그 다음에 이제 자치 정부 간의 대화나 이런 것들이 조금 그동안 잘 이제 확립이 되었기 때문에 아마 다른 나라들에 비해서 그런 부분이 좀 급진적으로 보인다라고 코멘트를 주셨고요. 특히나 이제 영국 내에서도 이제 대영 제국 내에서도 스코틀랜드는 조금 이제 비교적 작기도 하고, 그다음 이제 에딘버러가 이제 그 스코틀랜드 이제 정부가 또 있는 이제 도시다 보니까 그런 아카데미아 이제 학자들과 이제 폴리시 하는 사람들에 대한 서로 관계가 좋고, 그 폴리시를 이제 만드는 사람들도 이제 아카데미에 관심이 많다고 합니다. 이제 물론 이제 이러한 이제 그 활동가들의 이야기를 이제 경청하는 문화가 있음에도 불구하고 사실 스코틀랜드 내에서도 이 사람들이 이제 이야기하는 거가 좀 문화긴 하지만 그 이야기들이 정책으로 자리 잡히고, 그리고 정책이 또 임상까지 내려가는 아직까지 한계가 있다고 말씀을 주셔서 그런 부분들은 앞으로 또 이제 본인들이 이제 메꿔나갈 부분이 아닐까라고까지도 코멘트를 마지막에 주셨습니다.
한 가지 덧붙이고 싶은 게 있는데, 에이미 선생님 그 팀이 연구하는 그런 프로젝트들이 따로 이렇게 다 아까 있는 그 리버빌리티 그런 것처럼 하나의 그 프로젝트가 있으면 그거를 뭐라 그래야 될까, 연구 과정이라든가 그다음에 연구 결과를 그때그때 시시각각 블로그와 그 웹사이트가 따로 있어요. 블로그라든가 이게 프로젝트별로. 그래서 그걸 다 대중하고 공유를 하는 거예요. 되게 오픈돼 있는 거예요. 이런 점들부터 우리나라랑은 너무 다른 것 같아요. 진짜 트랜스퍼런트 하거든요. 그래서 정말로 그 블로그 아직도 다 있어요. 블로그며, 그리고 거기 그 연구에서 나오는 논문들 다 PDF로 다운로드 받을 수 있게 다 돼 있고. 근데 우리나라는 깜깜이잖아요. 무슨 국가에서 펀딩 받은 그런 프로젝트들이 어떻게 돌아가고 있는지 전혀 알 수가 없는데 거기서부터 다르다고 생각했습니다. 채팅에 또 질문이 2개가 올라왔는데요. 하나는 제가 누군지 다 압니다. 권재마 선생님이 섭식장애 심리치료를 오래 해오신 권재마 선생님이 질문을 하나 주셨는데요. 자기의 몸을 언어화하는 경향이 지적을 하셨고, 여기서 특히 되게 중요하고 흥미로운 질문하셨는데 문신을 연관시켜서 질문을 주셨어요. 이것도 아마 지금 연구가 되게 많이 되고 있을 거예요. 아마 뭐 심리학 쪽도 그렇고 문신에 대해서요. 그래서 문신하고 자해의 관계에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금하다고 말씀 주셨고, 또 이분이 섭식장애 치료를 오래 하셨다 보니까 섭식장애 관련된 증상도 자해 연구 맥락 속에서 어떻게 생각하시는지, 아니면 또 그 새로운 뭐 연구라든가 아니면 이 분야를 연구하시는 연구자분들이 있는지 이런 쪽들 답변 주시면 도움이 될 것 같습니다.
네. 첫 번째 문제가 그러면 네, 에이미님께 말씀드리겠습니다. So
네.
we have so the next question, Amy, kind of is divided into two parts. So this is kind of it goes under the umbrella term for narrating emotional bodies. So the first part of the question is, what do you think is the correlation between tattoos and self-harm? I think there's a big bulk of studies that's happening right now as well, but we'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And second part is specifically in relation to eating disorders, so repetitive vomiting, bulimic behaviors, binge eating, and also extensive exercise is also part of narrating emotional bodies. Because in one way we are utilizing our bodies to feel something. So, through your research, what have you learned in those certain behaviors?
Thank you for these both really interesting questions. I'll talk a bit to them, but I think both of them are areas that I think I'm really glad to hear if there's more work, especially around tattooing and self-harm. That's something I'll talk a bit about that first. So tattooing and self-harm has come up in, I guess, two different ways in my research. One of the main ways, and I did write a paper about this quite, 11 years ago now, a while ago, because for a number of the people that I spoke to in the very first study that I did, tattooing was a really important part of their recovery from self-harm. So it was a way in which they could kind of start doing things with their body, with their skin, that was decorative and positive, and for some was sort of tied up to kind of being able to live better with the scarring that their self-injury previously had produced, as it were. So it's kind of, so there was that aspect of it. Very occasionally it has come up as a form of self-harm, that for some people getting a tattoo kind of serves some of the same kind of purposes as self-injury had served for them. So in terms of physical sensation, the process of getting a tattoo can feel quite similar to some forms of self-injury, and also in a sense of kind of doing something in response to feelings that might otherwise be difficult to express, to process. So those are the two ways that it's kind of come up. I've not specifically ever looked at it, but it is something that has kind of just come up at numerous points through my work. And I would say, in terms of my own kind of experiences with and away from self-harm, tattooing has been a really important part of my own kind of getting used to a scarred body and living with a scarred body. Tattoos have been an important way that I've been able to come to terms with that for myself. So for that reason as well, I think it would just be a super interesting thing to kind of explore further. In terms of eating disorders and narrating emotional bodies, I guess actually that's just reminded me of one other aspect of self-harm and tattooing that has come up in some of my interviews. One interviewee in particular, Reese, whose words were kind of somewhere in the slides that I kind of gave earlier, she talked specifically about her tattoos and her scars as being a part of her kind of narrating her story on her body. You know, so for her, sort of both her scars and her tattoos told stories and helped her kind of remember and note kind of her passage through life. So again, there's these kind of instances in my data where it sort of points to something more that I'm really glad that others are exploring, and I know some studies have explored it. So yeah, it's a great area of topic. going back to eating disorders and the idea of narrating emotional bodies through, especially I think you flagged practices of bulimia and overeating and exercising. Again, in terms of my data, it's not something that I've ever focused on specifically, but a number of my participants over the years have shared with me experiences that have included self-injury and different aspects of things that might be called kind of eating disorders, and certainly that include bulimia, overeating, and exercising. And that's come out, I guess, one of the things that I'd kind of flagged in the recorded talk around the different ways people talk about these practices. And so for some people, these kinds of practices are ways of kind of maintaining control over the body and of emotions. And for some, it's a way of expressing emotions. And so these different kind of ways in which emotions are kind of talked about as being part of the body, and that is something that both self-harm and different aspects of disordered eating or exercising can sort of help with, has definitely been part of how some people have talked about it. I think in terms of Professor Kim's question earlier about how people's practices of self-harm might shift across the life course, I think that's something that I think it should be looked at, because I think it would be really fascinating to sort of see the extent to which different people might have very different kind of trajectories through and with those different types of practices with their bodies, and how they're experienced at different points in their lives. Yeah, I think it raises so many more questions. So I'm going to stop because it's just, I'm making things very complicated for translation. But great questions, both of them. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. 네, 우선 첫 번째 이제 문신간 관련해서 이제 말씀을 주셨던 부분은 이제 본인이 이제 당사자들과 이제 서베이를 이제 하면서 연구를 진행을 하셨을 때 이제 그들이 이제 문신 자체를 이제 자해한 부분으로 이제 바라보지 않았다는 게 조금 특이했다고 말씀하셨습니다. 그래서 이렇게 본인이 이제 그런 이제 몸에 이렇게 상처를 입힌다든지 그런 자해나 이제 그런 여러한 것들을 이제 문신을 통해서만 좀 극복하고 그거를 이제 그 아픔을 승화시키려고 하는 경향이 많았다고 말씀을 해주셨고요. 그래서 오히려 그런 문신을 하는 행위가 그들에게는 뭔가 이렇게 꾸미는 것, 또 그리고 긍정적인, 그리고 앞으로 잘 살아갈 수 있는 그런 동력이 오히려 되었다는 걸 조금 강조해서 말씀해 주셨고, 이 또 에이미 선생님께서 본인도 이제 직접적 이제 그런 이제 개인적 경험을 이제 말씀해 주셨을 때, 이 흉터를 딱 몸에 있는 것들을 좀 이제 잘 이제 가려줄 수 있는 그런 부분들이 있어서 그러한 이제 과거를 극복하는데 우리 좀 도움이 된 그런 도구가 되었다라고 말씀을 해주셨고, 또 이제 자기가 인터뷰했던 사람들 중에서도 이런 그 흉터와 그 다음에 문신을 이제 몸에 놓음으로써 자신의 몸에 대해서 다시 한번 기억을 하고 그걸 이야기화하는 거가 그런 회복의 중요한 과정이었다라고 이제 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그리고 이제 두 번째 이 섭식장애 관련해서 이렇게 중도적인 구토라든지 폭식 이런 운동에 관해서 말씀해 주신 거는 사실 본인 연구 이제 구체적인 주제나 이제 당사자들이 다 섭식장애를 앓고 있는 건 아니라서 좀 제한적인 어떤 의견이 있을 수는 있겠지만, 여기서 우리가 중요하게 이제 관통해야 할 부분은 어쨌든 본인들 몸에 대한 통제성을 가지고 있다는 부분이 조금 공통된다고 말씀해 주셨던 것 같고요. 그래서 이러한 이제 극심한 운동이라든지 반복적인 이제 구토를 통해서 몸을 자기가 통제하고 있다는 그러한 느낌, 그리고 이제 몸을 표현하고 있다는 거가 조금 자해나 이런 것들과 좀 비슷한 맥락이라고 말씀을 주셨고, 아까 이제 김 교수님께서 말씀해 주신 것처럼 이 나의 듦으로써 이 셀프함이 어떻게 또 진화하는지도 우리가 앞으로 같이 연구하면 좋은 부분인 것 같다. 왜냐면 그 형태가 달라질 걸 알기 때문에 어떠한 연관관계들이 있는지 보면 연구하면 좋을 것 같다라고 말씀해 주셨습니다.
10분 남았는데 짧게 신나리 선생님 질문을 요약을 하자면, 자해 흔적은 이제 당사자가 아닌 사람들이 딱 봤을 때 아까 말씀드린 비세럴한 반응이 오게 마련이잖아요. 근데 그런 반응이 아니라, 전형적인 반응이 아니라 다른 방식으로 반응을 한다면 자해하는 사람들이 감추고만 있었던, 억압돼 있던 그 감정을 다르게 소통할 수 있는 기회가 있을지, 그런 게 궁금하다고 말씀 주셨습니다. 어떻게 표현해야 될까요?
그러니까 제가 이해한 게 맞다면 이제 어떻게 그 자해 흔적들을 이제 보고 우리가 이해할 수 있는지 그런 질문일까요?
뭐라 그럴까, 상처를 보면 좀 부정적인 반응을 보이게 되는데,
네.
만약에 그게 그 반응이 아니라 조금 더 다른 방식으로 반응을 한다면 좀
그 자해를 한 사람들이 그걸 어떻게
어떤
느껴질지
네, 네,
알겠어요.
네.
Yeah. So last question, Amy, because we're running out of time. So this question, I'd say I think what is about, so as people who have self-harmed in the past, they live with scars on their bodies, and often those scars are quite visible. And the visibility of the scars can also evoke a very visceral response from the others. And I think that response also creates a secondary stigma and a negative response, which goes back to the self-harmed person to feel a bit ashamed. So this question is asking if let's say the public, let's say someone sees the scars of a self-harmed person, and that was in a different way, how that would affect the person who have gone through self-harm. So in essence, how can we, if we altered the views of people of seeing the scars from self-injuries, how would that affect people with self-harm change and how they perceive themselves? So it's quite like a philosophical question.
It's a really good question. It's something that that I have been thinking about for a while and continue to think with, because I think there's partly another question there, which is, can we alter the views that people have about scars? Because I think in terms of some of the individual stories that I've heard from people who have experience of self-harm, they have very positive narratives or stories about their self-harm scars, about their experience and survival or recovery from and with self-harm. And they, kind of have, in Reese in particular, I always come back to her because she had such a defiant story about her body and her body with scars, which she explicitly described as beautiful, as signs of strength and of coming through something, of having survived. And she was always very explicit, or told me in her account that she was explicit about that. If other people kind of said negative things about her scars, which they sometimes did, she would kind of just reject that. But I think those individual moments where we might kind of counter a negative reading of our bodies and our scars are potentially very powerful, could be really transformative for others. But there are also kind of individual moments that not everybody's able to give those sort of defiant responses. Many people, and certainly myself for many years, just continue to wear long sleeves and have bodies hidden so that I didn't have to deal with that, any kind of negative questions. So I think, though, that question of can we, though, more broadly try and shift how people might read and understand scars so that they are more positive. I think if we did, in theory, you would hope that might kind of reduce senses of stigma and shame among people who are who are still self-harming ultimately, who may not be carrying scars but are carrying wounds. But I think there are also real challenges there because even though telling kind of like more positive stories about scars, sometimes that might feel more positive because there's an understanding that self-harm then is in the past. You have recovered, you've come through it, and we can tell positive stories about that. So whether that would change the experience of people who are actively still self-harming and have more recent wounds and scars, I think that's a question there, and I'm not sure it's easily resolved, partly because of some of the things, the assumptions about what self-harm is seen to represent: distress, pain, disorder, challenge, and people's, and often society's unwillingness to face that. It disrupts social interaction if you're distressed and upset, and so self-harm, if it's more recent, can be seen as a sign that something is wrong, and that can be something people might not want to deal with. This is not a short answer to at all. I think it's such an important set of questions, though, because there is often an assumption that if we change self-harm so it's seen more positively, that will make things easier for people. But I think there are a lot more there are other questions that it also raises there about how straightforward that is, and I think that question that I started with about can we change how self-harm is understood. One final thing, just to kind of further make things more difficult for everybody, is that I think among people who work in more medical settings around sort of self-harm policy and so on, there are concerns about making self-harm seem positive, because there are concerns that if self-harm is seen as okay, that more people will do it. And this is something that within the Lancet Commission was a point where the lived experience group of writers, with myself and my colleagues, did not agree with some of our other colleagues on the Lancet Commission who felt that self-harm should only be talked about as something that was not something to be emulated. So there are real unresolved tensions, I would say, around how we destigmatize, can we destigmatize self-harm, and concerns, again, that others, I'm not sure I share this, but have that if you make self-harm seem okay, that loads of people will do it somehow. I think it's very tricky, very complex. Which is probably a fitting end to my complex chat. Sarah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. 총 세 파트로 좀 이제 말씀을 해 주셨는데요. 이제 첫 번째 우리가 이 질문을 이해할 때 중요한 부분은 과연 그 자해 흔적을 이제 바라본 이제 대중의 시선을 바꿀 수가 있는가였던 것 같습니다. 그래서 이제 본인이 아는 이제 과거의 자해 흔적에 관해서 굉장히 긍정적으로 자기 몸을 바라보는 당사자의 이야기를 말씀해 주시면서 이제 그 당사자분 같은 경우에는 자기의 자해 흔적들을 굉장히 이제 자랑스러운 부분으로 여기고 있고 누군가가 이제 부정적인 이제 코멘트를 할 때마다 굉장히 적극적으로 맞서서 대응을 하는 그런 부분이 있었다고 합니다. 그래서 그렇게 우리가 이제 스스로를 이제 인파워하는 그런 이제 그런 부분들도 있기도 하고 그렇지만 이제 대부분 그런 아는 게 현실이기 때문에 이제 에이미 선생님 같은 경우에도 이제 본인도 옛날에 자해 흔적들 같은 걸 가리기 위해서 긴팔을 입다든지 아니면은 이제 그런 사람들이 질문을 하지 않게끔 본인을 많이 숨겼다고 말씀을 해 주셨습니다. 근데 이제 이 부분에서 우리가 또 한번 고민해 보고 가야 할 것은 자해를 이제 더 이상 자해를 하지 않는 사람, 즉 이게 흔적만 남아 있는 사람은 조금 더 쉽게 본인이 회복을 하였다고 믿을 수 있기 때문에 이러한 이제 본인의 자해 흔적에 대해서 조금 더 긍정적으로 말을 할 수 있는 반면에 지금 아직 자해 중인 분들, 그러니까 좀 아니면은 이 자해 흔적이 조금 생긴 지 얼마 안 된 분들, 이런 분들 같은 경우가 그 진행 중인 분들에 대해서는 아직 우리가 조금 더 이야기를 많이 해봐야 될 것 같다라는 말씀을 해주셨고요. 왜냐면은 이 회복했다는 것과 회복 중에 있다는 건 좀 큰 차이가 있기 때문에 그 챌린지 안에서 우리가 이제 자해 흔적을 이제 어떻게 이해하고 그거에 대한 시선에서 어떻게 이해할 것이냐는 또 다른 문제인 것 같다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 그래서 마지막으로 말씀해 주신 거는 결국 과연 이 자해 흔적 이러한 부분에 대해서 그 전제가 꼭 긍정적이어야만 하는가라는 이제 말씀을 해 주셨고요. 그리고 이제 특히나 이런 이 자해 정책을 만드는 분들 아니면 정신과 의사나 그런 의료진 사람들 같은 경우에는 이 자해를 하는 거가 굉장히 긍정적으로 입히는 걸 조금 두려워한다고 합니다. 그 이유는 이제 역시나 좀 이제 대중들이 더 많은 사람들이 자해를 쉽게 생각하거나 자해를 더 많이 할 것 같은 이제 그런 부분들이 있어서 우리가 이 담론에 대해서 조금 더 조심히 한번 살펴봐야 될 것 같고 굉장히 대답하기가 어렵고 많은 대화들이 이루어야 되는 부분들이 있다라고 잘 마무리를 해주신 것 같습니다. 네.
마지막에 그 부분은 최근에 나온 책이 있거든요. 스티그마에 관한 책인데 아마 거기서 논의하신 거랑 맞물릴 거예요. 자, 여기서 이제 마무리해야 될 것 같은데요. 이 녹화가 영상이 되어 있어서 이건 유튜브에 업로드도 될 거고 또 제가 트랜스크립트를 그 프로그램으로 지금 받아놓고 있어서 이것도 다 이제 공유를 해드리겠습니다. 네, 그러면 마지막으로 에이미 선생님께 감사 인사를 드리고 저희는 내일 다시 뵙도록 하겠습니다. 감사 인사 좀 전해주세요.
네. Hi, Amy. So we'll wrap this up. This has been recorded and probably will be uploaded, assuming our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining early in the morning from the UK, and have a great week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
And for all the work.
Bye.
감사합니다. 내일 뵙겠습니다.